Chapter 8, Dynasty XVIII continued. Munspera Jehotimus III, 1600 BCE, the Alexander the Great of the Egyptian history. And let's go back a little bit here. We have Jehotimus, so M, and what's the other one? Menkepera, we have Ra Menksper. Okay. During so long a reign as 43 years, 11 months, and 1 day, an energetic king could accomplish much for his country. And that Jehotimus did. So is proved by innumerable ruined monuments, which date from his time. Egypt itself now forms the central point of the world's intercourse and affords us an insight into the national histories of antiquity. For this king undertook to measure himself in battle with the mightiest empires and carried his arms to the frontiers of the then known world, bringing home with him the spoils of the conquered people. We shall be astonished at the countless riches which were laid up in the treasures of the temples, and the same inscriptions on the temple walls, which then, in a better state of preservation, the wise men of Thebes read and explained to Germanicus on his visit to the old city of Yemen. So confirm what Tacitus has related. There were read to him, says the Roman historian, the tributes imposed on the nations, the weight of silver and gold, the number of weapons and horses, and the offerings to the temples in ivory and sweet scents. Also, what supplies of corn and utensils each nation paid, which were no less immense, that are now imposed by the might of the Parthians or the power of Rome. The records of this Pharaoh's wars were carved in hieroglyphs on the walls of the Holy of Holies at Karnak. Only isolated portions of the long inscriptions have been preserved, but these are still important enough to enable us to put together the principal parts of the record of the victories of Jehotimus III, and then gain a general idea of his campaigns. During a period of almost 20 years, he carried on more than 13 campaigns, in the course of which towns had to be stormed, rivers crossed, and many countries traversed under the difficulties of a foreign climate and a hostile population. Under the rule of, how do you pronounce that? Ra-Ma'at-Ka. The yearly tributes imposed on the conquered peoples had gradually ceased to be paid, and a deaf ear had persistently been turned to repeated warnings, until at last the foreign kings renounced the Egyptian supremacy under the scepter of a woman king and made a stand against the empire. A great revolution took place at this time in the Chaldean Empire. The ruling dynasty was attacked by the Arabs from the south and overthrown. A new era began, the era of the Arab kings in Babylon, who from this time bore rule for many years in Mesopotamia. All these events, which a short time before the sole reign of Jehotimus III, had made a great revolution in the life of the nations from the Euphrates as far as the Western Sea, could not fail to exercise an influence on Egypt. The tribes of the Upper Rufin, the Phoenician Karu, and their southern neighbors in Zahi declared themselves independent of the yoke of Egypt, and the king of Gaza was the only one who preserved his ancient friendship for the Egyptians. Rufin and Zahi formed the main points of attack in the different years of the war. After victories had been won, the king with his army marched out from the Egyptian frontier in the month of Vermuthi, probably towards its close. The point of departure being the fortress on the eastern frontier of Zaru, or Zuan Tanis. The following literal translation of the Egyptian record gives the further course of their campaign. Fragment 1, 2 through 5. The king Menxpera Jahata Nefer Xper Masis the third, may he live forever, has issued the command that there should be put up the report of his victories, which his father Yemen granted in the form of a memorial tablet in the temple which the king has erected to his father. You know, he considers the Theban Yemen to be his father. There is set forth the list of the towns which he has conquered in his campaign according to their names, with addition of the booty which was brought, the spoils of war, which was brought away by the king out of all lands, which his father, the sun entity Ra, had delivered to him. 6. In the year 22, in the month of Farmuthi, on the day the king found himself in the fortress of Zaru on his first campaign to 8. The frontiers of Egypt by his victories. Now the duration of the same was 2 years. The foreign kings had sown 10. Discord. Each was against the 11. The tribes which lived there, 12. In the city of Shehrohan made the beginning with Irza. 13. Found their termination at the extremest limits of the earth, with the exception of those who had raised themselves up against the king. In the year 23, on the 4th day of the month, Pachans, the day of his ascension to the throne, he found himself in the town which the ruler of the Gazatu, Gaza, had within 15. On the 5th of Pachans, he left this place full of power and strength. 16. In might and triumph to conquer that miserable enemy, and to extend, 17, the boundaries of Egypt according to the commands of his father Yemen, the silent one, who gives him what he possesses. 18. In the year 23, on the 16th of Pachans, he went to Ehem, the king. 19. Gave the order of for a consultation with his warriors on account of the war, speaking thus: that hostile king of Kadeshu has arrived. He has entered into Megiddo. He is there at this 21. At this moment, he has assembled with him the kings of all the tribes which dwell. 22. Over against the water of Egypt, as far as the land of Naharain. The 23. The Karu, the Phoenicians. The Kiddu, the Kittim. Their horses, their warriors. 24. He thus speaks: I will withstand. 25. At Makitha, Megiddo. Tell me, which is the way to break into the city. 26. They spake before the king, How would it be to force the way along? 27. That road which leads to the narrow passes, for there is intelligence. 28. That the enemies stand there and ambush and pass what is. 29. The road for a numerous body, for lo, a horse cannot go behind another, nor a man behind. 30. A man in like manner will not then the enemies rise up to. 31. Fight there while the army stands still. A broad road goes. 32. Out from Aluna. It offers them no opportunity for attack, and with respect to the way on. A broad road. 33. It is the only way. Take 34. Ta'an na ka. Thanak. This is how it's also known. Another way, which you might take into consideration. 35 is the road north of Ziphtha, Zaphat. We come out upon this to the north of Makitha, Harmageddo. 36, whenever our victory ruler will go, we follow him on it, the way. 37, only let him not lead us on the impassable road. And lo, 38, the spies arrived whom the king had sent out on account of the intentions of the enemy. And 39, they spake in the presence of the king. Then spake the majesty of Pharaoh, may he live and be safe and well. Thus, 40, as truly as the sun entity Ra loves me, I call to witness my father Gimmon, I, the son of the sun entity Ra. 41, with a pure life, I will enter on the road of Ah. 42, Luna, let him, whoever among you has the wish to enter on other roads which you have named, but let those of you come who will follow me. For thus would speak 45, the enemies who know not Ra. Does not the king advance on one, 46, of the other roads? He wishes to retreat for fear of us. Then they assented. 47, speaking thus before the king, may thy father Yemen of Thebes grant. 48, to us protection and safety if we follow thee, the king, into all places, wherever thou wilt go. 49, for the servant in the sight of the assembled warriors, while he spoke to them thus. 51, may Yemen give guidance unto good ways. Each one of the warriors took an 52 oath, speaking thus, I will not advance. 53, before the king in order to protect him against the enemy. I will leave him the king. 54, to go himself before his warriors. Then the king left his horse and went. 55, on foot, and those who went on foot, their horse was behind them. Thus the king advanced. 56, at the head of his warriors. In the year 23, on the 19th of Pachons, 57, the king's tent was pitched at the city of Aluna. But the king went on, 58, forwards. His divine father, Yemen-Ra, the ruler of Thebes, 59, was before him, and the entity Hormku, considered to be the god of light in Heliopolis, by his side. His father, 60, his father Yemen-Ra, lord of Thebes, victory for thine arm. 61, for the king. The battle begins on the side of the enemy. 62, in the tumult of the battle, numerous are. 63, the southern horn wing at the town of Ta'a Naka, also known as Tanakh 64, the northern horn wing at the corner south of the town of Harbaghetto. The king was in the face of them. 66, they fall to the ground, and the hostile king. 67, they. There follows a large gap of 3 or 4 lines. The following large fragment. Fragment 3. Luna, the rear guard of the brave warriors of the king remained at the town of Aluna. The advance guard came out into the valley. They filled all the ground of this valley. Then they spake thus to the king: would the king advance, accompanied by his warriors, to the battle? The valley is full of them. We will obey our war chief in the fight. We will protect our lord and the rear guard of his warriors, together with his people. And let me see how many numbers this is going to be, but I'm not breaking to say the numbers with this one, so. We will protect, 6, I'll just say when I'm starting up again if I stop. We will protect our lord and the rear guard of his warriors together with his people. We have left the rear of the warriors behind, that they might fight against the country of the that we may not act according to our will, our warriors. And the king took up a position outside them, there to protect the rear of his warriors in the battle. Then they reached the warriors came out on the south road of the ghetto, on the bank of the brook Quiana Kana'a. There had further passed by 6 hours of the day. Then was the camp pitched, and the king showed himself in the sight of all his warriors, speaking thus: keep yourselves ready, look to your arms, for we shall meet this miserable enemy in battle early tomorrow morning, because assembled at the tent of Pharaoh, it was composed of the baggage, of the guides, and of the utensils of the servants. When the watch had been set, when the soldiers kept, they spoke thus: firm courage, watch, watch, watch over his life at the king's tent. Tidings were brought to the king: Meru is of good courage, and the noble races and the warrior people of the south and the north land alike. In the year 23, on the 21st of Pakans, on the feast of the new moon, which is the anniversary of the coronation of the king, in the early morning, all the warriors ordered that they should open. The king went forth on the chariots of copper. He was equipped with all the necessary panoply. He was like Har, the smiter, the lord of might, and like Mentu, the lord of Thebes. His father Given made his hands strong. The horn wing of the warriors of the king at the southern mountain, stationed at the brook of Enna, the northern horn to the northwest of Megiddo, the king in their midst, Given at his side. His limbs, then the king prevailed over them before his warriors. They wondered at the king, and how he became their lord. They then fled head over heels to Megiddo, with terror on their face, and left behind their horses and their gold and silver chariots, and were drawn up by their clothes as by ropes into that town. For the people had barricaded the town itself on the account of the deeds of the king. 16. while they were being drawn up by their clothes from without into this town. Oh, that the warriors of the king had not yielded to their desire to plunder the goods of the enemy. Megiddo, at the same hour, for the miserable king of Kadesh had gone up together with the miserable king of that town, Megiddo, so that they escaped and went into their town. Then was the king enraged, and his crown gained power over them. Then their horses, their gold and silver chariots, which they had made in the land of Aseba, Cyprus, were made spoil. They, the enemy, like kicking in heaps, like fishes on the ground. The brave troops of the king counted up their goods. See, they have captured the tent of the miserable king, in which his son was. Then the warriors all at once raised a shout of joy and gave honor to Yemen, the supposed lord of Thebes, who had given to his son the victory, and of the king avouched his power. And they exhibited the spoil which they had taken in hands, and the living prisoners, and mares, and chariots, and gold and silver, and all of the things. Then spake the king, Thank Yemen for his protection, which he has afforded me and his beloved son, the sun entity Ra, on this day concerning all the kings of that people, who have shown themselves as enemies in their inward thoughts, and concerning the fact that might of Megiddo is the might of 1,000 towns, ye must make yourselves masters of it. The leaders of the bodyguard each to his place. And they left that town and remained at the rampart, which was encompassed with fresh green trees of all kinds of wood in the country. And it was a delight to the king to be within it, as a fortress on the east of that town. The king gave the order to finish the building at the place, and to surround it with thick walls and with thick battlements. And the king gave it the name of Men-Xper-Ra, who has taken possession of the plains of the Asiatics. And guards were set before the dwelling of the king. And the word was given to them, firm courage, watch, watch over the life in the king's tent. The king commanded the hostile inhabitants that none of them should show himself outside behind this wall, except at the exit in an opposite direction, at the gate of the fortress. All this did the king to this miserable king and to his miserable warriors. It, the record, was set up by day in his name and in the name, and it was set up on a roll of leather in the temple of Yemen on the same day. Then the kings of that land came together with their children to worship before the king and to implore breath for their nostrils because of the strength of his arm and because of the greatness of his spirit. And the children of the kings came before Pharaoh and presented their gifts of silver, gold, blue stone, and green stone. And they brought also wheat and wine and skins and fruits for the warriors of the king, and for every one of the Centi had taken care to have such provisions for his return home. Then the king graciously pardoned the foreign princes because of. There follows a complete list of the spoils, which consist, among other things, of 2,503 captives, cattle, silver, gold, and electrum, ivory and precious stones, cedar wood and ebony, furniture for tents and houses, costly inlaid work, fine cloth, and armor. The princes of Ruthen and Ashur, the lands of Punt, Cush, and Zahi, Uwat, Cyprus, and the powerful ruler of the Kheta tribes were all forced to pay heavy tribute. And Burke's translation of the statistical tablet of Dahota Spur Mus the Third, and Annals of Dahota Spur Mus the Third, in Record of Past, Volume 2, page 17. Then the king gave orders to set up the record of the victories, which he had gained from the year 23 to the year 32, which coincides with the erection of the memorial tablet on this temple wall. Thus has he done. May he live forever. The rich tributes and taxes which King Dahota Spur Mus the Third received in what are called the halting places on his campaigns, and those which the foreigners, especially the Ethiopians, brought to Egypt in person, were given over to the Theban officials that they might estimate them accurately according to the number and weight, and enter them in the account books of Pharaoh. The tributes of the tribes of the south, of the land of Punt, of the lands of Ruthen and Kepha, occupied the first place in the registers. If Lepsius's explanation of the Usem metal as electrum be right, according to a representation in a tomb mentioned below, not less than 36,692 pounds of it were carried into the treasuries of Thebes under Dahota Neferkspur Mus the Third, that is, a mass of 67 CWTS. What's that? Which, considering the rarity of this precious metal, seemed hardly possible. This usum seems much more likely to have been a mixture of metals resembling our brass, in which copper formed the principal ingredient. The tributes, well, some things occur, are pretty rare, but they occur certain places in enough quantity to basically have more than what the earth is mined. I mean, what has been mined from the earth. The tributes of the countries situated directly on the Nile in Upper and Lower Nubia were delivered to the Egyptian governor of the southern country in the time of Dahota Neferkspur Mus the Third, the king's son. Now he occupied this post, and according to the inscriptions on the rock grotto of Adasia, he filled the king's house with gold and made joyful the countenance of the king by the products of the lands of the south. The recompense for this is a reward from the Lord for Nahe, the king's son, and the governor of the south. After his brilliant campaigns on the Canaanitish soil, the return of the king of Egypt must have been one grand triumphal procession. The sight of the captive prince is their children and their subjects in the train of the young hero the numberless troops of horses, oxen, goats, and rare animals, in a word, all riches of the then known world, could not fail to make a deep impression on the Egyptians, and must have inclined the hearts of all to the young sovereign. The first thing was to offer homage and thanksgiving to who were considered to be gods for the victories he had won. Theban Yemen was the first thought of, and his temple treasury in Apet of the south was filled with princely munificence. In all quarters of the great city of Thebes, new buildings were added to those already existing, and before them were erected great gate towers with double wings and obelisks surmounted with copper tops. The broad surfaces served to receive the records of victory and the catalogue of the foreign nations which had been conquered. Before returning to Thebes, the king took care to found in the northern portion of the land of Ruthin a fortress of unusual strength which bore the name of Menxperah. Shenma, or Jahota the Fur Kuspur Mutsus the third, who has bound the land of the foreigners. It was situated near the Phoenician cities of Arathu and Zamira, at the foot of Lebanon. Another inscription still fairly preserved gives a full record of the expression of the king's grateful feelings towards Yemen. Directly after his return to Thebes, he instructed 3 feasts of victory in remembrance of his campaigns, in which naturally the national entity had the lion's share of the presents and sacrifices connected with them. They coincided with the day of the Feast of Yemen, of which, according to the calendar, a feast under Jahota the Firkspur Mutsus the third, there were 11. The calendar just named comprehended in all more than 40 feast days, the list which is given as follows. Eve, called Ket, a feast of Yemen, 1 day. Yemen's feast days, which take place every year, 11 days. Eve, there's not a V. Awa, Yemen's feast days, which take place every year, 11 days. The 4 Pekans feast of the occasion of Jahota the Firkspur Mutsus the third, 1 day. The feast of the Heb Ha'u on the 1st of Tibet, 1 day. Feast of the new moon, the 1st and of the 6th day of each month, 24 days. The king dedicated to the entity rich presents and sacrificial offerings for the times on the 3 feasts of victory. Likewise, on the great festival of the 14th of Pa'afeh, when the majesty of this glorious entity came in procession to celebrate the feast of his voyage in the city of Apet in the southern land of Ptoris, to thank him for victories over the land of Upper Ruthin. By order of the king, 3 cities were assigned to the domain of this entity, to pay yearly to his temple the taxes levied upon them. The edifice erected by Jahota the Firkspur Mutsus the third, to the honor of the entity as a memorial victory, called the Ku Menu. Splendid building of the Hall of Pillars was endowed from the booty brought home. 4 obelisks of immense height were erected, and statues were dedicated to his royal ancestors, while special feasts were instituted to Hremku and Amsu. The first campaign of the king against Upper Ruthin was the most important of all his wars. Its history may be seen in a very perfect condition in the lower story of one of the gate towers of Karnak, and is of inestimable importance for a knowledge of ancient geography and ethnology. The general superscription which relates to the towns of Upper Ruthen, as is translated as follows. This is the catalogue of the inhabitants of the country of Upper Ruthen who were taken prisoners in the hostile town of Megiddo. His Majesty took away their children as living prisoners to the town and fortress of Suhen and Thebes on his victorious campaign, as his father Yiman, who had led him on good paths, commanded him. Suhen designated a particular fortress situated on Theban territory and used for the reception of prisoners. A second similar catalogue of the same people, or rather of their towns, is introduced by the following inscription. These are in their entirety the unknown peoples of the furthest end of Asia, whom His Majesty carried away as living prisoners. Unknown was their land. It had never been trodden by the other kings of Egypt, with the exception of His Majesty. In a third catalogue, we find the following words. This is the catalogue of the inhabitants of the Upper Ruthen, whom His Majesty captured in the hostile town of Megiddo. His Majesty carried away their children as living prisoners to the town of Thebes, to fill the house of his father Yiman, who he considered to be his lord, of the town of Thebes, on his first victorious campaign, just as his father Yiman, who led him in good paths, commanded him. The value of the catalogue on the pylon at Karnak lies in the indisputable fact that more than 300 years before the entrance of the Israelites into the land of Canaan, a great confederacy of tribes of a common race, which the monuments call by the name of Ruthen, existed in what they call Palestine, under petty kings who dwelt in the very same towns and fortresses which, in latter times, mostly fell by conquest and at the hands of the Jewish immigrants. Among these, the kings of Kadesh on the Orontes, in the land of the Amorites, played the first part. The kings and their subjects from the Wadi el-Arish to the land of Naharain obeyed him as their chief leader. With these were joined the Phoenician Karu, who dwelt in the country on the seacoast, called Zahi, by the Egyptians, and whose capital was Aradus. Also the Kitti, the Chittim of the Holy Scripture, who had taken possession of the island of Cyprus, and in all probability of the seacoast lying to the north of Phoenicia, the triangle between the 3 points, Kadesh, Samira, and Aradus. Form the oft-mentioned theater of hostile encounters. The statements on the tablet of victory and in the list of conquered towns are confirmed by another witness. Yemen Mahab, an officer who took an active part in the campaign, has described on his tomb his course of life in plain and simple language according to the style of writing in his day, and he often takes occasion to admire the great deeds of the king, whom he accompanied in the closest attendance on his campaigns. The following is a literal translation according to Professor Eppers of the inscription. And we have, and again, I guess I'm going to skip saying the numbers, but we have 46 parts of this. So, I served my royal lord on his campaigns in the north and southlands. He wished me to stand by his side, and I fought hand to hand against the people of the land of Negev, southern Palestine. I carried off 3 grown Amu as living prisoners. Then when his Majesty went to the land of Naharain, I carried off 3 grown-up men in the hand-to-hand combat. I brought them before his Majesty as living prisoners. Again, I was in a hand-to-hand combat in that campaign against the people of the high plains of Uwan, probably the mountainous country on the banks of the Orontes, westward of the land of Kalabu. I made of the Amu living prisoners, men, 30 live donkeys, and 13 iron spears inlaid with gold. Again I fought, hand to hand in that campaign, against some people of the Emesha, Karkemish. I carried away some inhabitants as living prisoners. I waded through the water of Naharain, Euphrates, while they were in my hand, without letting them go. I brought them before my royal lord. Then he rewarded me with a rich reward, namely, I admired the brave deeds of King Munxperra, known as Jahota Xper Mussus III, the dispenser of life, against the people of Zor. He had done against them. I was a hand-to-hand combatant before the king. I made spoil of a hand. He gave me a golden reward for this, namely, and 2 rings of white gold. And again I admired its valor while I belonged to his servants. He took Kadesh. I did not remove from the place where he was. I carried off from among the nobles 2 men as living prisoners. I brought them before the royal lord of the land, Gahota Neperxpermus, may he live forever. He gave me a golden gift for my valor before all the people, namely of the purest gold, 1 lion, 2 necklaces, 2 helmets, 2 rings. And I admired my lord in all his appearances on account of the strength of arm and land. When it happened another time, I mounted up to the again. I admired the strength against the land of Takas, which is situated on the shore of Lake Nesru. I fought hand to hand on it before the king. I carried off 3 men of the Amu as living prisoners. Then my lord gave me golden rewards of honor, namely 2 golden collars, 4 rings, 2 helmets, a lion, and a slave. Again I admired another extraordinary deed, which the lord of the country performed in the neighborhood of Ni. And Ni is a town in the Naharain, considered to be Nineveh by some. He hunted 120 elephants for the sake of their tusks on his chariot. I encountered the greatest among them, which attacked his majesty. I cut through his trunk. Being still alive, he pursued me. Then I went into the water between 2 rocks. Then my royal lord rewarded me with a golden gift, namely, and with 3 dresses. Then, when the king of Kadesh sent forward a horse with the head of a which dashed in among the warriors, then I ran after him on foot, holding my dagger, and ripped up his belly. I cut off its tail and gave it to the king. Praise on the part of the Divine One for this. The joy which he bestowed filled my body, and pleasure thrilled through my limbs. His Majesty caused the bravest of his warriors to go before. The fortress was to be broken into, which the inhabitants of Kadesh had newly erected. I was he who broke into it. I was the leader of all the brave men. No other did it before me. I brought back of the nobles, 2 men as living prisoners. My royal lord renewed his thanks to me for this by the splendid gifts of every sort. Contentment was with that king. I achieved these battles while I was a captain. Then, he commanded that I should be the person to arrange the sails on a ship, and I was the first of his suit in the voyage on the river in honor of him. At his splendid festival in Thebes, the inhabitants were full of joy on that account. Lo, the king finished his course of life after many years, glorified by conquest and by victory, and by triumphs beginning from the first year down to the last of the month of Phamenoth, of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Munqsper-Ra, Gahota Nefer Qsper Mas, the justified. Then he flew up to heaven. When the disk of the sun went down, the successor of who was considered to be a god joined himself to his parent. When now the earth became light and the morning broke, the disk of the sun rose and the heaven grew clear. Then was the king Yemen Hatuptup II, may he live forever, placed in the seat of his father, and he took possession of the throne. The greatest fullness of strength was his, for the foreign inhabitants of the Red Land, Tisherit, and their chiefs had he subdued, appearing like her, the son of Ast. Yust. So he took possession of Egypt and the inhabitants of this land, and they who dwelt in the land of Kenempte, the oasis Magna. And all the people bowed down before him. Their gifts were on their backs, while they begged of him the breath of life. Then it was that his majesty looked on me during the festive voyage that he celebrated on the ship, the name of which was Ka-Wa Sutton. I conducted the disembarkation at the splendid festival of joy in southern Thebes, in observation of the prescribed order of the festival. Then they took me up into the interior of the king's house, and I was made to stand before the king, and they spoke before him. Xpru-Ra, concerning my merit. Then I fell down forthwith before his majesty, and he spake to me thus: I know thy words. I lay still yet in the cradle as the child of the deceased lord of the land, when thou didst already serve my father. Let an office be granted to them by my order. Be from this time forth a commander, Madame, of the army, in pursuance of what I have said. Watch over the brave troops of the king. The commander Ma accomplished all that he had said. The brave captain had evidently several campaigns in view of his account, but the first certainly formed the chief part of his own history. On his return home, our hero had the honor of conducting in his own person the holy ship of Yemen on his journey to Thebes, to his splendid festival, allusion no doubt of the same festival which Gahotepsper-Mus the third had mentioned in his record of his donations, and which fell on the 14th day of the month Pa'afe, an examination of the tablet of victory, which relates the campaigns of the king from the first battle of Megiddo onwards. leads us to the certain conviction that from the 23rd to the 40th year of his reign, Trahote Neferkspur Mas III undertook 15 campaigns against the inhabitants of Western Asia, so far as the fragments will allow. The following is the general summary of them.